Now, some common sense over the weekend from a respected source. Mel Bruff, the architect of the Northern Territory intervention, he said the voice to Parliament will fail to represent the very people it's supposed to. He called it delusional, the idea that a small group of Indigenous representatives could effectively provide policy advice on behalf of all Aboriginal Australians. Now, I am very pleased to be joined here tonight by academic and Indigenous affairs commentator Anthony Dillon, who joins me now at the desk. Anthony, thank you so much for your time. I've loved the stuff that you've written in The Australian about this, and I think you're one of the most sensible voices on the topic of the voice. But what did you make of what Mal Bruff had to say on the weekend?
Yeah, it was pretty interesting to see him come out, and I think he's in the right area. That it's how do you represent these people, and of course, what is driving is this identity politics ideology that if you're Indigenous, you understand everything Indigenous, which is just absolute nonsense. We've got a great variety of voices amongst Indigenous camps, and they should all be heard at some stage or another. But there needs to be careful thought about who will have a chance to say.
Yes, and you've written quite eloquently about this in The Australian, as I mentioned before, that Indigenous Australians already have, a voice to Parliament. They have voices in Parliament. There's 11 members of Parliament and the Senate that count themselves as Indigenous, which is a great credit, I think, to the electorate. They're representing all Australians. As I was pointing out earlier on in the show, you've got the Council of Peaks, you've got the, a whole ministry around this subject. So what you've said, though, is that this is really nothing more than identity politics rather than actual practical politics. Can you talk us through, in your own words, about what your concerns are in that regard?
Well, I guess one of the arguments that has been put forth to support the voice is, well, what we've been doing in the past hasn't worked. The gaps broadening, etc., etc. Therefore, the voice will fix it. Well, from what I've seen so far, I think the voice is just going to be more of what we've had in the past. And the reason why the gap hasn't been closing is because you've got, identity politics, you've got PC, rather than focusing on the hard issues. And, let's not forget, at the end of the day, we're talking about real people.
Yes.
Aboriginal lives, mums and dads and kids. We want to be able to put food on the table, get adults into jobs and that sort of thing. And I think there's a good chance we're going to see more of what we've seen for 20, 30 years, apologies, changing of street names, talk about reparations, what's going to offend me tomorrow, that sort of thing.
But these are, to put it in kind of, I guess, simplistic terms, these would be sort of very urban concerns. These are concerns of people who live in the cities, Aboriginal people and also white people who live in cities, versus, what Jacinta Price has talked about really shockingly, the stuff that we would never tolerate if they were to occur in any sort of suburb of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or Adelaide or Perth. The real sort of devastating violence and crime and alcohol abuse and, terrible things happening to children, if we don't have any detail on this thing, won't it just be hijacked by kind of a city?
There's a good chance. To the credit of the report, the Culmer report, they have mentioned, they recognise that there's diversity of problems and concentrated areas. Yeah. But when the rubber hits the road, are we going to see a focus on these places, and are we going to address the elephants in the room? Are we going to tackle the tough issues of alcohol, for example, and bringing employment to these people?
It seemed to me, that Labor on the one hand says we want to give Aboriginal people a voice, great, but then when people were saying no, keep the cashless welfare card, they said no, we know what's better for you, and we're going to take it away. What was your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, the voices for these areas, remote areas, which Jacinta's very familiar with. Yeah. The voices we should be listening to are often those who cannot speak English. Yeah. Okay. So we need people like Jacinta's mum, Bess, and other reliable translators who can sit down with them and find out from them what's happening and what they want, what they need. Not just always the English speakers who are often, privileged and sometimes biased.
Yeah. No, that is fascinating. I want to ask also about, the government is just refusing to tell us really any details. They say it'll be dealt with by Parliament. What do you think of that?
Maybe they don't want us to know. Maybe they know that it's going to be more of a showy thing of more identity politics and that sort of thing. So, people are saying there's a reluctance to support it because we don't know what it is. If we did know what it is, maybe we definitely would not support it.
Yeah, and I want to ask you too, just on this whole topic, because of course this has been debated for decades in Australian politics, and we're getting those cabinet papers released from the Howard government, and they said that the Howard government and Philip Ruddock didn't want to issue an apology because they didn't want to create this idea of collective guilt, and they thought that would be divisive. What was your reaction when you read that?
Look, I can understand that, how you've got to exercise some caution. They did what they felt was best at the time, and certainly there would have been people yelling out reparations perhaps. So, it may have been okay to do a general, we apologise for what happened,
yeah,
that sort of thing. But,
yeah,
and the whole thing for me anyway about the stolen generation, which is a murky area, is that people spoke about healing. Healing comes from forgiveness, not receiving an apology.
Yeah, look, I think that point about forgiveness is one that we miss far too much in these debates. And just one last question before you go. Australia Day remains a vexed question, and we've seen this whole question of companies now saying, oh no, if you don't want to celebrate, you come into work today and you take another public holiday down the track. I've got a lot of problems with that. Not the least is that like a public holiday is something that everyone's supposed to get. Well, everyone except for journalists like me.
Yeah.
But what is your reaction to that sort of thing?
It's more wokeism.
Yeah,
it's not going to help anyone, and they're just trying to again reinforce this message that the day is somehow offensive.
Yeah.
To Aboriginal people, which it's not.
Yeah, and I mean, shouldn't we all have a day where we can come together? Because wouldn't people complain about any day?
Yeah, there's always a reason to be offended about any day. So yeah, one day where we can come, the majority of us, excluding you, the hard-working journalists, can come together and throw a frisbee and have a barbecue and that sort of thing.
How good does a frisbee and a barbecue sound? Anyway, thank you so much, Indigenous commentator Anthony Dillon. Really appreciate your time.